All right, great. And so for today, the day of 8 billion, we're very pleased to have with us, as you can see to my left, Maria-Francesca Spatolisano, Assistant Secretary General for Policy Coordination and Interagency Affairs in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. Ib Petersen, the Deputy Director for Management at the UN Population Fund, or UNFPA, and John Wilmoth, Director of the Population Division in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs. And they're going to brief you on today, the day that we have anticipated that the world population has now reached 8 billion people. Ms. Spatolisano, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's on. So as announced on 11th of July, when we shared the latest round of United Nations estimates and projections of world population, today, 15th of November, the world is reaching and surpassing probably the milestone of 8 billion inhabitants. The unprecedented growth of the global population is the result of two parallel trends. On one hand, the gradual increase in average human longevity due to the widespread advances in public health, nutrition, personal hygiene, and medicine. And on the other hand, the persistence of high levels of fertility in many countries. As the world is meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, marking the 30th anniversary of the adoption of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, as you know, COP27, this is a moment to look beyond the sheer numbers and to reflect on the impact of our growing human family on the planet. This is also a moment to ask ourselves how we can lift up all 8 billion people, ensuring that they enjoy a good quality of life and empowering the most marginalized among them. Ladies and gentlemen, there is no doubt that both unsustainable patterns of consumption and production and the rapid growth of the human population have contributed to environmental degradation, climate change, and deforestation, and the loss of biodiversity. Yet, the relationship between population growth and sustainable development is often misunderstood. Certainly, rapid growth in population poses challenges to economic and social programs as it makes eradicating poverty, combating hunger and malnutrition, and increasing the coverage of health and education systems more difficult. At the same time, and this is perhaps less evident, achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, especially those related to health, education, and gender equality, will contribute to slowing global population growth. So expanded opportunities for education and employment contribute to a decline in fertility by changing incentives and intentions around marriage and childbearing, and by promoting individual autonomy and decision-making, especially for women and girls. While it is true that slower population growth, if maintained over several decades, will help to mitigate environmental degradation, too often population growth is conflated with a rise in greenhouse gas emissions, and that ignores the fact that countries with the highest level of consumption and emissions are those where population growth is slow or even negative. Meanwhile, the majority of the world population growth is and will increasingly be concentrated among the world's poorest countries. These countries, which have significantly lower emission rates, are likely to suffer disproportionately from the effects of climate change, in part because they lack the resources needed to adapt to these changes and to mitigate their impacts. So, ladies and gentlemen, in order to usher in a world in which all 8 billion people can thrive, we need a rapid decoupling of economic activity from the current over-reliance on fossil fuel energy, as well as greater efficiency in the use of such resources. wealthy countries and the international community can help to ensure that developing countries receive the necessary assistance, both technical and financial, so that their economies can grow, but do so using technologies that will minimize future greenhouse gas emissions. And more broadly, we need to redouble our efforts to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals by 2030 through policies and programs that make our world more inclusive, more equitable, and more sustainable. And I'm very glad to be joined today by my colleague John Wilmoth, the Director of the Population Division in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, who can assist in addressing any question that you may have. But before that, we have my colleague E. Petersen.
Mr. Petersen.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, I guess it is now. I'd like to state on behalf of UNFPA very firmly that we consider this actually a moment of a success story, not a doomsday scenario that we are now 8 billion people. The world is now home to 8 billion people as a result of longer lifespans, lower maternal and child death rates, and better health care. But what is truly unique about this moment in history is not the number we have reached, but the unprecedented demographic diversity we now see between countries. And as the pace of population growth has slowed down, many nations are actually experiencing declining and aging populations, while others have large youth populations. In fact, the median age in Europe is 41, while the median age in sub-Saharan Africa is 17. So this means that people the world over have starkly different needs and starkly different opportunities. We in the international community must address this diversity when planning solutions for the world's most pressing problems, as was underlined by my colleagues, such as climate change, conflict, and inequality. And this means tailoring population policies and programs at the country level to help governments navigate the coming changes in the populations. At UNFPA, we are on hand to help countries build institutions and societies that can thrive in the face of new demographic realities, with a focus on helping women and girls worldwide access their reproductive health and rights. In our work with countries and governments and civil society as well, we time and again found that most effective solutions are the ones that are tailored directly to address specific challenges within the context in which they occur. These are solutions that are people-centered, expanding opportunities for marginalized groups like women, people living with disabilities, or LGBTIQ+ communities, among many, many others. In some countries, this might mean expanding access to family planning services as their populations grow. In some countries with older populations, it can include instituting adult education programs to ensure that people have access to schooling and women have supportive paths to the workplace. And in conflict settings, our support might have to be more fundamental, providing people with food, water, shelter, and basic reproductive health care. So we face diverse challenges in our modern world, and let's approach finding solutions for them in the same way. Only then can we usher in a future in which all billion of us can thrive with equal rights and opportunities for all. Thank you.
Thanks. Mr. Wilmoth, over to you.
I have no prepared statement, but I'm here to
Okay.
assist in answering questions as needed.
All right. Then we will go straight to our questions now. We'll first go to Valeria Rebecca, the president of the UN Correspondents Association. Valeria.
Thank you so much, Farhan. And on behalf of the United Nations Correspondent Association, thank you for this important press conference. Valeria Rebecca from ANSA Newswire. My question is, half of the populations live in only 7 countries, and the population growth has become increasingly concentrated among the world's poorest countries, most of which are in the sub-Saharan Africa. So what are the most pressing steps that the international community should take take to ensure that all countries, regardless whether their population are growing or shrinking, will be able to provide a decent quality of life for their people? Thank you so much.
Who wants to take it? Well, it's true, that, as you say, that the global growth has become increasingly concentrated in relatively poor countries. And this is one area of concern. When we talk about global population growth, we really have two areas of concern. How it affects poor countries that are growing rapidly, and how it affects the entire globe in terms of environmental issues. And in order to address this, governments can help people to have access to the means of controlling their own fertility, and in essence, empowering them to make decisions in their own lives about how many children to have and when to have them. And so, this is a partial solution in terms of helping people to control the size of their families, and that helps to restrain population growth. But of course, the broader solution is to implement the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and work on achieving the SDGs. As my colleague pointed out, much of the growth would slow down in almost all of these countries. Population growth would slow down if we achieved the SDGs. More education, greater gender equality, more access to healthcare. All of these things will help to bring down the fertility rate and therefore slow the rate of growth. That's the process that's been going on. That's part of our projections already. It's what we anticipate for the future. But if we want to accelerate the process, investing more in those areas would be critical.
Yeah. Edie?
Thank you very much, Edith Lederer from the Associated Press. Mr. Wilmoth, I assume this is going to be your question. You made this forecast in July. People have asked me, is it accurate to say still that November 15th is the day? Do your statistics still show that? And how was this day arrived at?
Well, there's no new evidence that we've considered at this point. I mean, it is based on the evaluation that was released in July, and at that point it was a projection based on previous trends, based on the best information that was available at the time. So we consider that November 15th is our best estimate of when the global population is crossing this milestone, but we acknowledge that we don't know for sure the day when this is going to happen, and we think it could easily be plus or minus a year from this date. So there is uncertainty. Let me give you an example of why there's uncertainty. The census of India was supposed to take place in 2021, but because of the pandemic, it's been delayed, and I don't think we'll have the results, for another year or more. So, when that comes out, we will have additional information that's going to be very important in terms of determining what was the real size of the population at this moment in time. So, of course, there's uncertainty, but it's based on our evaluation as of last July, and it is literally the day in which our projected global population crosses the 8 billion mark. We didn't cook it at all. It was based on our best evaluation as done in July. Today's the date that the line crosses 8 billion.
Okay, Yoshita?
Thank you. Yoshita Singh with Press Trust of India. India is forecast to surpass China next year as the world's most populous country. Do you have an estimate of around what time of the year next year would that happen? And going forward, for how many decades would India be the most populous country till some other country takes over? And also just some of the key lessons and takeaways would you be looking at India as the world's most populous country? Thank you.
Well, I can try and take that. We do not have a date. That we've not specified a date. We could make that calculation if people are interested, but it hasn't been something that we focus on. Again, there's a great deal of uncertainty, especially given the lack of the recent census. As far as what's the overall significance of this point, I think it's mostly symbolic. As far as which country is the largest in the world. For each country, China, India, it's continuation of past trends. And the only thing that I would note is that the path that these two countries have taken towards slowing their population growth has been rather different. For India, it's been a much more gradual process. The fertility rate has been coming down, but much more slowly. And that means in every sense that the change is more gradual and smoother in some ways. For China, it was a rather abrupt change back in the 1980s. The reduction of fertility was very rapid. This led to a population age structure that today is somewhat inverted, and it's become a cause of concern for the government, and they've even tried to increase fertility in recent years. So this does have different implications for the two countries, but the fact that one is becoming larger than the other next year, I think that's mostly symbolic in its importance.
Thanks. Deji?
Hi, actually, I was about to ask which country has the 8 billionth baby, but I know that's not something you can answer. This is Deji Shu with China Central Television. So my question here, I got a graph. Let's take a look at this. We got 4 billion population in 1975. 2 billion in 1928. Every 50 years, it seems the population doubled in the world. So what is your prediction of the trajectory of the world population? And given the fact that nowadays we have already facing the crisis of food, especially in developing countries, in Sub-Sahara African countries, how would you suggest different governments to help in dealing with the food crisis, given the increase in population?
I'm going to propose that I answer the first part, and then Eve takes over and maybe answers the second part. But as far as the billion milestones and so forth, it is quite interesting to observe that the first, it took humanity a long time to reach 1 billion. That was around 1800. Then it took more than 100 years to get to the second billion, to add the second billion around 1930. Then just 3 decades to add the third billion around 1960, and then a decade and a half to add the fourth billion in 1974. But from 1974 until today, we've added 4 billion. We've gone from 4 to 8 billion. So we've roughly doubled the human population in half a century. And each of these last billions has been added in roughly 12 years, from 1974 till today. And so we've had kind of a constant rate of adding an additional billion. And that's, even though the growth rate has been going down, it's been operating on a larger and larger base. And so we've been roughly adding, for as long as I can remember, we've been adding about 80 million people per year to the human population. And so that times 12 gets you close to another billion every 12 years. But that's going to change now as we move forward, because the growth rate has now fallen to a point where the annual increase will start to decline, and we will add fewer and fewer people each year. And the next billion, we anticipate it will take as much as 15 years to add it. And then the next billion after that, 21 years. Of course, these are just approximations, but it's clear that the time between subsequent billions will increase as the annual increment of the human population slows down.
Yeah, I think what is important here to say also, what can we do? You mentioned the famine in Somalia. Actually, we're looking at a very dire situation on the Horn of Africa. But I just want to say it's not the number of people who are causing these circumstances. It's we have it, and it was mentioned already. The climate changes we are seeing, conflicts in many places, and so on as well. But of course, it becomes then kind of a clash of different challenges. What has historically really been shown to work is to provide people with a choice themselves, and of course provide them with the means to exercise that choice, in particular women and girls, to give them education, to provide them with access to reproductive health services, to decide themselves when and how many kids to have, and so on. That is actually what is what we see from UNFPA, one of the major policy moves that needs to be taken by governments. It has to be owned at the top stages as government. And then, of course, you need to address the other issues as well. But we need really to have a focus on that, and that has shown really to be and have an impact.
Okay. Kristen?
Migration is such a hot button issue in so many countries. I'm wondering if you've thought about or considered the implications of the changing demographics in terms of migration and what that might mean. I know it's a very broad, open-ended question, but I'm just curious your thoughts on that.
Well, I can start off. Of course, it's one of the elements that you need to look at when you look at a global picture where you have different demographics in different countries. And you have some countries, as was said now, with lower fertility, with lower populations, aging populations. And that, of course, will lead to consideration on how do you basically sustain these societies so they can provide the opportunities and the services that we have talked about. And vice versa in the countries with huge, in some mentioned sub-Saharan Africa, where you have a huge young population. And of course, the challenge for policymakers there is to make sure that there is employment and a sustainable living there. So somehow looking at the global picture, but we are not a migration agency as such, but it's clear that some of these elements are those that can be brought into to play policy-wise by governments. But it just underlines again, we need to look at the totality of factors and we need to a coherent approach. And basically the numbers are not the important things here. And there's no such thing as a precise number that will make things go in one or in the other direction. It's providing people with opportunities that's the most important part. You want to?
I think that's fine.
Okay, Evelyn?
Thank you. Evelyn Leopold, Globetrotter Media, Past Blue. Could UNFPA kindly expand on what's been happening with contraceptives among women who would want them? Are they available? We're not just talking about sub-Saharan Africa, but Asia and other populated countries where people have heard of it, but are they available? Are they being pushed by any different organizations besides UNFPA? Thank you.
Contraceptives are available, but not in enough scale. That's for sure. We launched earlier this year the annual State of the Population report. It showed that we call it the hidden crisis, actually, or the unseen crisis. It showed that we have almost half of all births every year globally, meaning around 120 million, are unwanted pregnancies. And they are a sign of for many cases that women don't have the access, or young girls, to decide themselves when to have babies. So it just underlines we are working very hard in many places. Actually, we are present in 150 countries over the world, also in conflict settings where we can see this is a major issue. Also to make sure that we can provide women and adolescent girls with the choices and the contraceptives. We do it. We are supporting that they are distributed also in refugee camps in many places around the world. But it's clear more needs to be done in order to make sure that all women, all adolescent girls have the opportunity to choose themselves and have access and information about it. So that's something that we also with our annual population reports and so on, trying to really make a call to action among policymakers. Lots of private organizations are working on this as well, and I think increasingly there will be a more vocal voice also from women and adults and girls around the world that this is needed. Also, the right contraceptive. We can see from data also that there might be places where women have access to some contraceptives, but they're not comfortable or sure or feel safe about these different things. So that just shows that we need the data and we need to work at a local level.
Okay. First, we'll go to Pam Falk in the chat room, and then we'll go back to the room. Pam?
Yes, thank you very much. It was a fascinating report. I'm getting an echo. Are you?
No, we're fine.
My question is for Mr. Wilmoth, mainly because you're so on top of this report. There's an interesting point in the report about gender, the gender divide, that there are slightly more men than women today, but that will even out by 2050. what does that mean? Is there a trend? Will it go further than that by the next 50 years, so there are more women than men? And to what do you attribute it? Is it conflict and wars, or picking off the men, or what? Why would there be such a progressive change? A continuous change.
Thank you, Pam. I'm trying to figure out what you're referring to exactly in the report. We don't anticipate that the number of men will equal the number of women. For example, at older ages, there are many more women who survive to older ages than men, and that will not change. There's a different sex ratio at birth, where we have slightly more boys born than girls. This is a natural biological phenomenon, but because of the higher mortality of boys and men, there's an overall female advantage in terms of survival and numbers, especially at older ages. So I don't think that's fundamentally changing. What you may be referring to is the difference in life expectancy between men and women, which in the past was probably just 1 or 2 years. I'm talking more than 100 years ago. And that gradually over time, that gap opened up, and it's now as much as 5 and 6 years in many countries. And that may be related to the fact that most deaths, the leading cause of death in highly developed countries over the past 50 years has been cardiovascular disease. And that's one cause of death where there is a big sex difference in terms of vulnerability. And other causes of death are not so different amongst men and women. The risks of infectious disease, the risks of cancer, and many other causes of death are not so different between men and women. But with cardiovascular disease, there is. So I think it's partly the fact that in this time period that we've been living in for the last several decades, cardiovascular disease has dominated mortality, especially in developed countries, and that has produced a rather big gap in life expectancy. As we increasingly control mortality from cardiovascular disease, we may anticipate that there would be a decline in the gap between men and women in life expectancy. But I don't think that ever gets to a point where the number of men outnumber women, especially not in the older age ranges.
Okay.
All right, this was from the November policy brief that updated the report. It just said there were slightly more men than women today. But anyway, you answered the question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks. Ephraim?
So much. Thank you very much. I have 2 questions. The first one is also about migrants. I remember, Mr. Wilmoth, last time you were here, you mentioned that in some developed countries, the only population growth that's happening is really coming from newly arriving migrants. And I wonder if you were able, throughout your research and work, to reach some insight about that topic that could probably translate into some recommendations for how developed countries should deal with the questions of migration and migrants within this context, if possible. That's my first question. And then a second one, really struck by what Ms. Spatolisano said in her statement about the importance of changing incentives and intentions around marriage and childbearing, and by promoting individual autonomy and decision-making, especially for women and girls. And this made me wonder how much of the population growth and the number we're discussing today, 8 billion, is sort of a result of the lack of education, or a result of young women not being able to decide whether or not they can bring a child forward. Just if there's a correlation with that. And along the same lines, I'm sorry if it's a long question, is there a correlation between women rights development, or how developed are women rights in a certain country, and the population growth rate? Is there a correlation scientific between these 2 things as well? Thank you.
I will answer the first part of your question, then you may have to repeat the second part because I missed a slight part of it. But regarding migration, yes, it's true that there are some countries, some areas of the world, Europe in particular, where growth in recent years has been driven partly or even primarily by immigration. And in the future, in the coming decades, we expect that for some of these countries, immigration will be the only source of growth, that otherwise they would be declining in size just based on the balance between births and deaths. So, but what is the policy recommendation from the UN in terms of how to deal with this. I mean, first, I think it's important to recognize the role of these migrants in those countries and in those economies, and recognize what they're contributing. But the policy framework that exists for addressing such issues is what's contained in the Global Compact for Safe, Orderly, and Regular Migration, which really lays out a very comprehensive approach for dealing with international migration from a 360-degree perspective, dealing with the security issues, but trying to also make good use of the opportunities that migration offers for development, both in the countries that they're from and the countries where they are currently residing. But as far as there are many aspects of how to address the issue, but probably the most important in some sense is for countries to find ways of creating more legal pathways for migrants to cross borders, because the real challenge comes from irregular migration that's not fully authorized, and that's really the essential harm. I think the harm comes out of that, the fact that many people cross borders without authorization, and yet there's a demand for this, and so countries need to acknowledge that demand and create sufficient legal pathways to accommodate the demand for migration. The second question, I'm sorry, do you want to answer it?
It's just our understanding that, yes, an expanded opportunity for education and employment, as I said, contributes to low fertility rate, because women's choices and autonomy in the decision probably, bring them to make a more limited, to give birth to a more limited number of children. The purpose, as my colleague said, is for every children to be wanted, not only every human being to have a decent quality of life, but really to welcome every one of these 8 billion people. And to do that, you have to have the possibility to choose, as we were trying to argue. I think there is a correlation.
Ibtisam?
Hi, my name is Ibtisam Azim from Al Arabi Al Jadid newspaper. So you touched a little bit upon the subject, but if you could elaborate, it's about the issue of or how important that this growth that we are seeing in the world, that goes hand in hand with economic growth, that takes into consideration also the environment. And do you see that governments are doing enough in that direction, and whether industrial countries are doing enough to help countries who are not, who didn't contribute to the pollution and to the environment that we are seeing? Are they doing enough to help these countries to bring this economic development hand in hand into the growth that we are seeing in population? Thank you.
Well, it's correct that the countries that are grown in terms of population, as we see it now, and has pressure, they're not the countries that have, if we take the climate, for instance, contributed the most to global greenhouse gas emission. In fact, we know that in 2019, CO2 emissions in the United States, which is a country with a very low fertility rate, was 147 times higher than that in Niger, where I have a very high fertility rate. So I think it's like we mentioned earlier, that there is this combination of factors that are having an impact on the environment, and which makes it even harder for a government in a poor country with high fertility rate to make the choices necessary and find the resources to provide efficient health services and the other elements that have been, as we can see, contributing to the to lower the fertility rate in many countries. So I think it's very important to look to our colleagues right now in Sharm el-Sheikh and say, please do the job, because that's going to have such an important part in addressing the issue of how can we make sure that every child is a wanted child, every birth is a wanted birth, and all people, in particular women and adults and girls, they have the right to choose themselves, and they have possibilities for exercising that right.
If I may.
Please.
You asked a question which has its own answer in it, of course, otherwise we wouldn't have a COP27 discussing all these things. But I think that it's fair to say that the picture of, say, Nigeria and the US is the two extreme. In the middle, there is a lot of different situations whereby countries with big population have also a high level of emissions, so it's not a clear-cut answer or a clear-cut division. I think everyone has to have a share of the responsibility from now on, at least in this, solutions we have to provide to the climate challenges we face. And the SDGs, of course, and the COP27 and the Financing for Development Conference all try to give a contribution, an answer to this at the global level, in a global way, in a coordinated way. Thank you.
Thank you. And I would like to thank again our three guests, Maria-Francesca Spatolisano, Petersen, and John Wilmoth. Thanks very much for your briefing, and have a good afternoon, everyone.